Well, hi, and welcome to Coffee and Hardtack, a bi-weekly digital program from the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin. We talk to Civil War historians and educators, and we are so excited for today's topic. My name is Jenn Edginton. I'm curator of education at the Kenosha Museum campus, and with me, as always, is Doug Dammann, our manager of education department, as well as the curator of the Civil War Museum. And we're very excited for our special guest this week. We have Megan Kate Nelson with us today to talk about her research and her book. I have it, The Three-Cornered War. I came prepared. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm so glad. Well, first things first, can you tell us about yourself?
Sure, of course. I was born and raised in Colorado. And from the very beginning was a total reading nerd, read all kinds of stuff, fiction, nonfiction, but really what kind of sparked my love of history was these summer trips I would take with my family. My mother didn't really like to fly, so we would get in the car, and for 2 weeks, right around this time actually, kind of, well, a little earlier, like early August, we would set out from Colorado and just drive across the United States. So I've seen all of the upper Midwest personally, usually from a car window. And we would stop along the way and, go to various sites and, weird, like the largest ball of twine and, amusement parks. But then we'd also go to historic sites. And so from the beginning, my interest in history and my sort of understanding of history was embedded in the landscape and moving through the landscape and reading maps and sort of being in place. And so anyone who kind of runs into my work anywhere will see that influence because The Three-Cornered War, which we'll talk most about today, I think is my third book, but my previous two books, the first on the Okefenokee Swamp in southern Georgia, and then the second called Ruined Nation, which is about destruction in the American Civil War. All three of those books have kind of landscape in common and sort of how you sort of gain a sense of history in place, and then also how landscape shapes how people live and how they fight and how they establish community. So that's really what kind of sent me in this direction. But I also, readers of The Three-Cornered War will also find it's structured very differently than a kind of normal history book. And so it hopefully to you reads more like a novel. And that is because I could never choose between history and literature. And so I was a double major in college, and then I was an American Studies PhD, actually not a history PhD. So I was able to do both history and literature, and then also art history and landscape studies and all sorts of other things. So that's kind of where all that came from and where my interest in history came from.
That's great.
Speaking of landscape and space, your book focuses on the Civil War in the extreme West, New Mexico, Arizona. And I'm sure a lot of our viewers realize that Civil War battles did happen in places like Glorieta Pass, and that there was a lot going on out in that vicinity. Can you comment on how the battles and movements of the armies and their interactions with the native peoples in the area truly made the Civil War a continental event at this time? I think so many other times people think of it just,
Absolutely.
it was in and around Richmond or Washington, D.C., or if they know a little bit more about the war, they may know about the Western Theater and along to the Mississippi River. But so much was going on west of the Mississippi.
Exactly. There's a whole West that's west of West. This is the thing that is totally crazy. And this is my, the war that you guys are explaining and sort of displaying at your museum in the upper Midwest is what a lot of Civil War historians think of as the West, right? The Western theater. And so this has been my battle. And so I actually have a challenge. I have a challenge for everybody out there and all of my colleagues that we are now going to talk about the Eastern Theater, the Trans-Mississippi, which is you guys, and parts further south along the Great Waterway, and then the West, which will be the Pacific to about the 100th meridian, right? So, and the reason for that is, and I think this is part of the reason that so few people actually know about these battles, unless they're really into Civil War history or they're Westerners really into Civil War history. This is part of the problem, is that we have this kind of nomenclature that doesn't allow us to think that anything happened west of the Mississippi River, right? But as you guys know, and also I think nobody thinks that anything happened in the upper Midwest either. Even, oh, sure, there were some soldiers from there. In Sherman,
right?
but what else could have possibly happened, right? So when you start to look at places like the upper Midwest, and you start to look at places like the desert Southwest, it really changes your view of what the Civil War was, right? And what the battles were really about. And so for the case of the Southwest, that war began in the summer of 1861, when John Baylor, totally without orders, took 300 cavalry across the border into Mexico, took the town of Mesilla, forced the surrender of a federal fort called Fort Fillmore, and then sat down and created the Confederate Territory of Arizona, which extended from the Rio Grande to the Colorado River. And he was sort of the vanguard, and then this larger army of 3,000 soldiers came in a Confederate invasion that was meant to take the West for the Confederacy, to sort of get a hold of the gold mines, get a hold of Pacific ports to help pay for their war in the East. And then also to establish kind of a foothold so that they could expand into the larger West, and then maybe also south into Mexico. And that entailed also, they had a fight with, and wanted to fight Union forces there and defeat them. But this plan necessitated defeating and removing Native peoples as well. And I think when you focus on the Southwest, and then also I think on the upper Midwest, you see these other communities, you see Indigenous communities kind of come into play much more clearly. And then you start to say, okay, so the Civil War it was clearly about slavery and about emancipation, but it was also about empire and expansion. And so that meant that it was about either exterminating or removing Native peoples from all of those Western lands and turning them into productive farms or ranches or mines that Anglo settlers would then own or just kind of run, or whatever they were going to do with them, build upon. So that is how it kind of reshapes our sense of the war as a continental conflict. That this was something that involved both the North, the South, and the West. And it was about building the nation. And so it kind of had this, especially for the Union, this really hard kind of truth for a lot of people to wrap their minds around, which is that the Union Army was fighting simultaneously for emancipation of African Americans in the East and eradication of Native peoples in the West.
Yeah, and we're lucky because we're a museum system. So we have the Civil War Museum and we have our public museum, which is really, we have a large section that does talk about Indigenous history and Indigenous cultures that are still around today. We focus on the Potawatomi and the Anishinaabe that call the Great Lakes home still, and did a long time ago. Mm-hmm. So the Native aspects of your book really resonated with me as the person that gets to teach about this and work with the Indigenous population of Wisconsin. So for you, Native stories are so often overlooked, especially when we talk about these larger contexts. So the Civil War in general, we don't really focus on the Natives that fought, that were pushed off land, that were there still. So why was it important for you to tell these stories of these Native people in the Southwest?
Well, I think, sort of like it is for you guys, once you start to investigate the kind of realities of the past, you realize how important Indigenous communities were, how they were present throughout, these long periods of time. They did not disappear, right? In the face of mounting pressure from the federal government and from the American military. They defended their sovereignty and they stood their ground. And I think it was important to me, what was really interesting to me was determining how different the experiences were among Indigenous communities, just in this, just in New Mexico and Arizona. And I think that's important for all Civil War historians to realize too, that and you guys know this, that, Native America is not one thing, right? Mm-hmm. It is made up of many, many, many different communities, and they all had different experiences. Some groups throughout the West, living in all different parts of the larger West, had almost no contact with Union armies, and certainly had no contact with Confederate armies after 1862. And others established alliances. Others sent soldiers. I think there's been, the place where there has been a lot of really good work has been Indian Territory, and a discussion of all 5 of those Indigenous communities and their internal divisions, and kind of thinking about Indian Territory as a kind of border territory. We think about the border states, but I think we should think about Indian Territory as part of that, because they were pretty divided. They sent soldiers to both armies, and they experienced the kind of chaos that other border states and territories did. So, there's been a lot of good work there, but nobody really talks about the 20,000 Indigenous soldiers who fought on both sides throughout the war in all different regions, not just in the West. And then there are communities like the Chiricahua Apache, the Navajo Diné, and the Mescalero Apache in New Mexico that engaged in full-out battle. And that would include also the Dakota in Minnesota. So there were groups that actually waged war against Union armies. And those battles, there's a small group of us kind of trying, kind of started with Ari Kelman with his book, A Misplaced Massacre, about the Sand Creek Massacre in southern Colorado, and sort of saying, in these regions, the Civil War was an Indian war. It was a war of empire, and this is the form that it took. And this was explicitly a Union army that was engaging with these groups. So it was important to me as I started to do the research here. Initially I started with the Union Confederate fight because that was the first that I found out about. But as I started to realize how important Indigenous communities were, not only kind of in that first phase of Union Confederate fighting, because what happened there is that particularly the Navajo and the Chiricahua Apache took advantage of that fight to continue their strategy that they had used for years, hundreds of years, to raid wagon trains and camps and corrals, because here suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, there were 7,000 men on the roads of the Southwest with these huge wagon trains. The Confederates brought with them a 3,000 beef cattle herd to feed them along the way. And, they're all strung out in the line. It's like easy pickings, right? For communities that had that tradition of kind of quick strikes and siphoning away animals. So these groups were not only shaping the Union Confederate War as it was happening, but then engaged directly with both in this region, both Confederate and Union armies. And so once I figured that out, I was like, this really was, as a California soldier called it, a three-cornered war in the Southwest. And the soldiers perceived it that way. Indigenous communities knew that there was this larger conflict going on that they were now a part of. And the Civil War itself was very important in bringing those soldiers into the region. And kind of forcing a more violent conflict with particularly the Navajo.
Megan, you talked earlier about kind of the narrative aspect of the writing of the book.
Mm-hmm.
And what really kind of propels the story is, I think you tell the story through the viewpoints of 9 different characters throughout the book.
Yes.
One of those is a Midwesterner named Louisa Canby, who is
Mm-hmm.
from Indiana. Can you tell us and our viewers a little bit more about her as a teaser
Sure.
for them before they get into the book?
Sure, yeah. And I should say, you know, the reason that I chose to tell the story through individuals is, I think, kind of the same reason that you guys do in the museum, right? Don't you have individual stories, and when people come into the museum, they can sort of learn about individuals and kind of go with them, and through those individuals learn about the larger conflicts. And that's a hugely effective way to do that. Plus, you know, people want to read about people, right? It's fine to read about ideas, or to think about ideas when you go to a museum, but I think it's much more interesting for people to actually attach those ideas to the actual lived experiences of individuals. So actually there are 3 Midwesterners in the book. Louisa Canby is one of them. Yes, she was born actually in Kentucky. There were a lot of people with Kentucky roots. And both she and her husband, E.R.S. Canby, who she called Richard, were born in Kentucky and then were raised in Indiana. And so she was from Crawfordsville, which is a little northwest of Indianapolis. And she lived there, you know, all kind of grew up there, and then went to Kentucky to go to college, to a collegiate institute. And right before she went, she met Richard, and they very quickly decided they were going to get married, but she insisted that she finish her education first. And so she did. Yeah, and he was at West Point. I know. Louisa Canby is a fascinating person because, you know, she seems like she would be a kind of conservative individual, you know, given just her circumstances. She came from a middling household, you know, but she was educated. And so she insisted on this, and they got married after Richard graduated from West Point. And then she just left. She went, and she was kind of an early adopter of what we would call like the army wife life. Like, she was one of the few, and there were some women who did this. They were almost all officers' wives, but there weren't that many of them. She went with him starting in the late 1830s. She went first to Florida when he was fighting Seminoles in the Second Seminole War. And they went to Utah during the Mormon War. They were in California during the statehood fight. They went through the Panama Canal. I mean, she is probably one of the most well-traveled women in America at mid-century, just because she went with him almost everywhere. The only campaign she did not join him on was the Mexican-American War. She did not go south. So she's one of these really interesting people. I chose her not only because she was going to give me the civilian viewpoint. She stayed in Santa Fe during the entire early phase of the conflict. She was there when Confederates took that city, so she was kind of what Civil War historians call an occupied woman, where she was living in an occupied city. And she was also a nurse. She helped to nurse wounded soldiers and help and transport them actually from the Battle of Glorieta back to Santa Fe. So she was known by Confederate soldiers as the Angel of Santa Fe, which kind of got her into trouble with the locals because they thought maybe she was, a Confederate sympathizer, basically. So she is an interesting character kind of in her own right. And we see, so she was also good friends with another major figure, John Clark, who was the Surveyor General of New Mexico Territory. And he was born in New York, but came with his family to Michigan first, where his father was a surveyor. And then he ended up in Freeport, Illinois, where he helped to lay out that city, and then became kind of he was one of these, again, there are all these like 19th century guys who did like 15 things. They had like 15 jobs. So he was a surveyor, he was a lawyer, he was a local official, he did all of these things. And so he ended up getting appointed in 1861 to be the Surveyor General of New Mexico Territory. Stayed there the entire time. The book begins in the summer of 1861 and ends in the summer of 1868 when the Navajo negotiate their way back to their homeland. And Clark is there pretty much the entire time. He has some furloughs. He goes and he visits his family. He goes to DC to talk to Lincoln and to the General Land Office. But the entire time he's in the region, he wrote 25 journals that are now saved at the New Mexico History Museum at the Chavez Library. And so that was amazing when I found those, and I looked at them and I was like, oh my God. Because, all throughout he's also drawing maps and doing little sketches. There's a little sketch he has of a Zuni woman at a loom weaving, which is crazy. And I mean, it's not a good sketch, let's be clear. But that's why we like to look at the original documents, because that kind of thing is not in the transcript. So he's another Midwesterner, right? And he ended up, I think actually, ultimately he ended up in Kansas working for the railroads in their land offices, because they all needed surveyors. And then Alonzo Ickes, who volunteered for the Union and fought Confederates at Valverde, was a gold miner in Colorado. This is where he was when the call went out for troops. So he was technically with a Colorado independent company, and then later was reorganized and sent to the Trans-Mississippi, I think as part of the Second Colorado. But he originally, he was actually born in Ohio, but then his family moved to Iowa, and they were farmers. And then he went with his brother when gold was found in the Rockies, and they went and tried to make their fortune. So it's really interesting to me that a lot of these folks who end up in New Mexico are in fact from the Midwest, and their families, and maybe you guys see this, and maybe this is also part of your museum, that people who end up in the Midwest during this period are sort of part of families that I would call kind of Westerning families. Like they've moved several places already, and they're kind of already really mobile and really willing to embrace that kind of travel, which I think we think of today. If you've ever driven, through the country, it's a huge country. I mean, it takes already a long time by our standards, now that we're used to air travel, to even drive at, 80 miles an hour. But the Confederate soldiers who were coming from San Antonio to El Paso, it took them more than 2 months to do that on horseback, So it's like, these are long distances. And part of the reason I think that these folks are willing to do it is because they're part of these families that have already done it. Like they've already kind of been moving around. They kind of embrace that whole idea that you can move somewhere and make yourself anew, right? So those figures were all really interesting to me, because a couple of other ones were from Kentucky. The only, there are 2 indigenous figures in the book, and of course they're from their homeland territories in what became New Mexico and Arizona. But the other figures are, 2 are from Texas via Kentucky, and the only one who's not from that whole region is James Henry Carleton, who's from Maine. But it is a book that has a lot of people with Midwestern roots.
Yeah, I noticed that when I was going through, and I was getting excited, like, oh, we can talk about this at the museum.
Yeah.
But we do a lot, especially with field trips, talking about moving and how much the people of Illinois and Indiana and Wisconsin, which we talk about, are either coming from the East Coast for kind of that better life, or they're immigrants coming from other countries to establish themselves. So they're people moving here. So it totally makes sense to continue on their journey.
Absolutely.
Or those upland Southerners, like you described, from Kentucky moving into Indiana, ultimately to Illinois, like Lincoln, the path that Abraham Lincoln took to the Midwest. So
Yeah, so you've got that sort of like those people kind of moving up that path, sort of following either, kind of Mississippi, Missouri watershed, and then you've got the folks who just moved directly west from the south.
Using the Great Lakes. Yeah, using the Great Lakes from New York State coming to Wisconsin.
Yeah. A lot of that. I know you mentioned this like very briefly, so I'm wondering if you can do kind of an overview snapshot, not too in depth, but and you don't cover it in the book, but we talked very briefly about the Dakota War.
Yep.
And I think that when we're filming this, the anniversary is,
yes,
I think it was Monday. But
Yep.
I would like to know, could you just give us a quick little snippet of what the Dakota War was?
Sure, yeah. So this is another one of those instances in which Indigenous communities are kind of experiencing the war in different kinds of ways. So one of the precipitating factors for the Dakota War is that the Civil War kind of mobilizes all of these soldiers who have been posted at forts along the Dakota Reservation, and they disappear. And so they get shipped out and moved to go fight Confederates. And it creates a crisis in terms of distributing annuities because there's no one there to do it. There's no one there to transport it. So the Dakota who are on the reservation have a survival crisis, right? They have a food crisis, and this prompts them to act and to start to raid towns in Minnesota, kind of outside their reservation boundary line. And that creates tensions with the white populations, as you might expect. And yeah, so that this conflict kind of, I think everyone agrees, started on August 17th, 1862, when 4 young Dakota men killed 5 white settlers over, I think, some disputed raiding of eggs and theft, and then fled to the reservation and asked to be protected. And the leaders there, some of them said, okay, yes, and then marshaled all of their fighting men and started then about a 6-week conflict with Union troops, and that lasted into kind of late September. But there was a significant element, a kind of peace faction that emerged also during that conflict. But so it was an interesting engagement that was kind of partly military, but then there was also a diplomatic element to it. There's also an element of prisoner kind of exchange, kind of a taking of prisoners or hostages, and negotiations to exchange them, which makes them part of a larger conversation about that practice kind of in the military and in military conflicts. Ultimately, the Union Army took a little more than 300 Dakota men prisoner, and were going to kill all of them, put them to death for their treason, basically, against the United States, which is an interesting legal issue, because can you be a traitor if you are not technically citizens of the country? This, of course, is one of the driving questions, in the Civil War as well, because Confederates didn't see themselves as traitors because they saw themselves as having seceded and created their own nation, rather than being rebels within the United States. So looking at the Dakota War kind of gives us this really interesting, I think, viewpoint of the Civil War and a lot of the larger questions of the Civil War, just through a different sort of lens. And this, of course, also is a famous moment when Lincoln himself got personally involved. The legal skills that he had honed in Illinois came into play, and he started going through all the records, and he actually ended up kind of commuting the sentences of most Dakota men. But then he also, I think, was kind of making a decision based on political leanings. He knew that Anglos or whites in Minnesota, if there wasn't kind of blood for blood, would perhaps rise up, perhaps create some problems for him in an area of the country where he didn't want problems, given the way the war was going with the Confederates. And so that he did, in fact, kind of okay the hanging of 38 Dakota men in December of 1862. So this is one of those moments where Lincoln's kind of Indian policy, his own kind of frontier mentality as someone who grew up in a frontier community in what we now know of as the West, or the Midwest, but was the West then, kind of collides with his presidency, with his beliefs about federal power, and his desire to kind of keep the upper Midwest kind of in the Union. And it's still disputed. And the Dakota War is becoming a kind of central area of inquiry, I think, for Civil War soldiers. There are a couple people who are doing some work right now. John Legg is one of them. He's a PhD student, and will be writing his dissertation on the Dakota War and its memory. And the Dakota community has produced a lot of really great primary documents out of that conflict. But it is, and I should say that in New Mexico, James Henry Carleton had just kind of taken command of the Department of New Mexico from Richard Canby at this moment. And when he heard about the Dakota War, he was really, he kind of went on high alert. And he had already been planning to launch campaigns against Chiricahua Apaches and Navajos. But that particular conflict, when he heard about the Dakota War, that actually kind of helped him make his decision to launch those campaigns, because he wanted to prevent that kind of large-scale warfare that involved so many civilians. And he wanted to force the surrender of these particular indigenous groups in the Southwest before it came to that. So that's an interesting connection between those two conflicts, which you wouldn't think had any connection whatsoever.
Well, Megan, for those folks out there, other than, of course, your book and picking that one up and taking a look at it, can you recommend other sources, books,
Sure.
Podcasts, informational sources for people who want to know more about the Desert Southwest and what was going on during the Civil War?
Sure, yeah. So there is actually, and I should have taken it out, it's up in my, you can see my journal copy, it's right up here. The Journal of the Civil War Era had a special issue, I think it was December 2016, and that has 4 essays from different parts of the West. And I've got a piece in there, but there's a part on kind of California and railroading, and then there's a Plains Indians piece by Pekka Hämäläinen, and a couple other kind of bits and pieces in there that'll give people some nice bite-size kind of views of the Civil War in the West. Also, if you are more kind of military history inclined and like that kind of story, there are 2 books. I've got them here. I came prepared to the coffee talk. So one is Billy Kaiser's Coast to Coast Empire, which came out like, I think just a year or 2 ago. I mean, these are both very recent, actually. I was sort of like, I was in the middle of finishing the Three-Cornered War when these came out, and I was like, come on, guys, I needed these before, like, so you could take all your best material. But so this is New Mexico borderland. So there's a lot also here about Mexico and about diplomacy with Mexico. So if that's something of interest also, take a look at that. And then this is Andy Masich's award-winning book, The Civil War in the Southwestern Borderlands, which talks about a lot of the same military campaigns that I do in the Three-Cornered War. He does not go into such depth about the Indian War that was the Civil War in this region, but he is an expert particularly in the California column that was moving from Los Angeles to the Rio Grande under James Henry Carleton, and this book is very good on kind of the military particulars. And then just one more book, if you're interested in kind of the National Park Service and the politics of memory, Ari Kelman's A Misplaced Massacre is a really great book about kind of trying to identify the site of the Sand Creek Massacre and kind of the battle between National Park Service and then Cheyenne and Arapaho people kind of trying to figure out how to memorialize this, where they should memorialize it, and why they should memorialize it. So yeah, I think those would all be a kind of good start. I mean, it is a kind of new field. It is a growing field, and it's really exciting to be a part of it.
Well, that was fascinating. I'm going to buy all those books, so thank you.
Awesome. Well, they would be very excited. I'll be like, hey guys.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I really learned a lot during this, and I was really excited to have you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been great.
Yeah, thanks, Megan.
And thank you for everyone listening.
Yes.